Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about an HOA that wants me to join. I've never been the type of person who likes to be pushed around. Growing up, my grandfather always taught me that if someone tries to take what's yours without a fair agreement, stand firm. It was one of those childhood lessons that stuck with me through every major life decision. When he passed away, I inherited his old countryside property, acres of land that, while not too far from the nearest town, was somewhat removed from busy suburbs and their peculiar politics. The soil was fertile, the trees were mature, and the memories were abundant. My grandfather and I used to spend weekends there, planting fruit trees, walking along the creek, and admiring nature. So when I moved in permanently, I never imagined I'd come to loggerheads with an organization that claimed they had dominion over my land. At first, I was just thrilled to be living on the property I'd loved since I was small. My plan was straightforward: fix up the old farmhouse, grow some heirloom tomatoes in the garden, and maybe keep a few rescue animals in the barn. Nothing too big, just a low-key life where I could enjoy fresh produce and give a second chance to a few animals in need of care. The front porch still had that classic country appeal, with a wooden swing that squeaked when you sat on it. I felt a deep connection to the space, as if my grandfather's spirit was still around, guiding me through the new chapter of my life. Before settling in, I was aware that there was a neighborhood association further down the main road. However, my property deed and my grandfather's old records made it clear that his land was never part of that group. He'd opted out way back when the local developers first organized it, believing that nobody else should dictate what you can and cannot do on your own property. In those days, the farmland was separate from the new residential tract, so there was no question of merging them into one big neighborhood association. As a result, I wasn't expecting any drama. Folks would wave at me when I drove by, and I'd wave back. It was simple and neighborly, just the way I'd grown up believing things should be. The fun began one bright Monday morning. I was out in the garden wearing a wide-brim hat and gloves, plucking weeds around my row of zucchini plants. The sun was just starting to peak, bathing the dew-covered leaves in a gentle sparkle. I noticed a rather fancy car pull into my gravel driveway. Silver paint, tinted windows, low-slung chassis. It was definitely out of place among the tractors and pickup trucks I usually saw around here. Out stepped two well-dressed individuals who had that air of corporate smugness that I'd sometimes encountered in city council meetings or real estate seminars. They introduced themselves politely enough, telling me their names were Fiona and Bernard. No last names offered, and I didn't ask. Both wore matching polo shirts with the name of the local homeowners association embroidered in small gold lettering near the pocket. I recall squinting against the sun as they greeted me. They began their sales pitch about how wonderful our neighborhood was, listing all the amenities and benefits one could enjoy by being a proud member of the association. I was half amused because I'd never considered my corner of the property to be part of that neighborhood. They insisted that since the developments had expanded over the years, the community now included my land too. They explained it as though it was some inevitable truth, something no one could possibly question. The conversation was friendly at first, but as soon as I mentioned that my grandfather had specifically excluded this parcel from any possible annexation, their expressions changed from cordial to annoyed. Fiona's plastered-on smile twitched in a way that suggested she wasn't used to hearing no. She tried to hand me a folder stuffed with paperwork. I took it out of politeness, but I had no intention of signing. I told them plainly that my land was not and had never been part of the association, and that I had the original deed with explicit legal language proving it. Bernard, who'd been standing by quietly, chimed in that recent expansions gave them the legal power to bring non-member properties into the association if they determined it was necessary for uniformity. "This is a courtesy meeting," he said, "to let you know about the upcoming changes. We strongly believe all homeowners in this area should band together." My hackles rose because the statement reeked of arrogance. They were telling me what I was going to do, as though I had no choice in the matter. After politely declining a few more times, I thought the conversation was over. They drove away without incident, but not before giving me a final stare that said, "We'll be back." I shrugged it off, tossed the packet of forms in a drawer in my living room, and focused on my daily tasks. I had some rescue dogs to feed and a few orchard trees that needed pruning. I'd always found solace in hands-on work. It kept my mind at ease, kept me in touch with the land, and reminded me of my grandfather's lifelong dedication to self-reliance. Over the next few days, I heard nothing, A part of me naively assumed that maybe, just maybe, they realized their plan wasn't going to fly. Then, toward the end of the week, I started receiving letters. Not friendly letters from neighbors welcoming me, mind you, but official-looking letters with the Homeowners Association logo. They rattled off citations from their bylaws, claiming they had the authority to impose membership fees, property guidelines, and more. They even told me about architectural standards I'd have to adhere to, like what color I could paint my house. The old farmhouse was a warm, mellow yellow passed down through generations. And the type of fence I could build. I had a split-rail cedar fence that was older than me and still standing strong. All of this was so bizarre that I found myself in disbelief. I called my friend Ingrid, who had some legal background, to vent. She was quick to reassure me. "They can't just annex your property," she said. "You have the deed. They can't override that." Ingrid offered to look over the documents anyway, just to confirm. True enough, every letter they sent was more of a scare tactic than an enforceable legal notice. According to Ingrid, it was all smoke and mirrors. But that didn't stop them from escalating. A week later, I got a knock on my door. It was Fiona again, this time with a new associate named Elton. The first thing I noticed was her stiff posture, her forced grin, and the way she carried a thick binder in her arms like some kind of script for a play. Elton's face had this practiced sternness, as if he were there to intimidate rather than negotiate. Right away, Fiona told me that my grace period was coming to an end, and that I needed to sign the membership forms to make it official. I asked, "What grace period are you talking about? I never agreed to anything," she retorted. "Everyone in this community is automatically subject to the association's regulations. You've been living here without contributing to the upkeep." It took every ounce of patience not to laugh outright. Instead, I calmly said, "I'm not part of your association. There's no legal path for you to force me in. Please leave." Well, that definitely struck a nerve because Fiona's calm facade broke. She glared at me and said, "We're not leaving until we resolve this." Elton quickly stepped closer, as if to physically underscore the seriousness of her statement. My adrenaline spiked. I demanded they get off my property or I'd call the county sheriff. Fiona's retort, "We'll call 911 ourselves if you don't comply. It's the right thing to do for the community." I stood there flabbergasted. Call 911 for what? Because I wouldn't sign some bogus forms? This was the height of absurdity, yet she was deadly serious. I told her, "Go ahead, call them. Let them know you're trespassing on private property and harassing a property owner." To my surprise, she dialed. She might not have called 911 immediately, but she definitely picked up her phone and threatened to do it if I didn't settle. I told her to leave once more. She and Elton walked away, but not before throwing out a final line. "You might as well join voluntarily. If you don't, we'll make sure you join eventually. Understand that however your mind allows." A pit formed in my stomach when I heard that. It was less about the content of their threat and more about the way they delivered it, like they knew some underhanded trick or had some grand scheme in the works. It was unsettling. I went back inside, locked the door, and paced around the living room until my nerves calmed a bit. I called Ingrid again, told her about the confrontation, and she was astounded that they'd threatened to call 911 over something that was purely civil, not criminal. She said, "If they really do call, let them. They can't do anything but embarrass themselves, but keep your own record of everything. Document every visit, every letter." I took her advice. Over the next few days, I started a journal. I jotted down every piece of mail, every phone call, though I rarely picked up after seeing their caller ID, and every in-person visit. I even started installing a modest security system. Nothing fancy, just a few motion-activated cameras around the property, plus a sign that indicated the place was under surveillance. I hated feeling like I was in some sort of turf war, but it seemed necessary. Weeks went by without another encounter, but the letters continued, each more threatening than the last. They started using words like legal action, mandatory compliance, and lien on your property. My anxiety rose, but I was determined not to let them bully me. Then, one afternoon, things escalated faster than I could have imagined. I was out on the porch, sipping a cold lemonade after a long morning of tending to my orchard and the rescue dogs I was fostering in the barn, when I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. It was unusual, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe an ambulance was headed somewhere else. But the sirens got closer. Then I saw 2 patrol cars making their way up my gravel drive. I put down my drink and walked outside to greet them. 2 officers stepped out, one looking more seasoned, the other a bit younger. Right behind them was Fiona, plus another HOA representative I'd never met before named Candace. Both were wearing those same embroidered polo shirts. Fiona pointed at me dramatically, as though identifying a suspect in a police lineup. The older officer approached me first, a look of confusion on his face, while the younger officer approached Fiona, apparently trying to figure out why on earth he'd been called here. The senior officer asked politely, "Sir, do you know why we're here?" In a calm voice, I explained that these people had been harassing me to join their homeowners association. I told him that they'd threatened to call the authorities, and apparently they made good on that threat. He gave me a look that signaled he already suspected this was a frivolous matter. Meanwhile, the younger officer was taking statements from Fiona, who kept gesturing wildly at my property as if it was some crime scene. I overheard snippets of her rant. "He's violating our community bylaws. He refuses to abide by the guidelines. He's not paying his fees. We want him to sign." The younger officer looked back at me with wide eyes, clearly perplexed. Eventually, both officers converged to talk to me again. The senior one said, "We're told you're refusing to follow certain regulations, but they don't have an actual claim that you've committed a crime. Can you clarify?" I calmly walked them through the story. How my land was never part of their association, how they'd been threatening me, and how their so-called rules do not apply to my property. I even showed them the deed that I'd brought out from my house, just in case this nonsense continued. Ingrid had flagged all the relevant clauses, and it was pretty straightforward. Candace tried to interject, claiming something about zoning expansions and community synergy. The cops asked if there was an actual court order forcing me to comply with any of it. Of course, they couldn't produce one. They just kept referencing their membership documents, which mean nothing outside of their own limited jurisdiction. The officers were, to put it mildly, shocked at the audacity. They looked at Fiona and Candace like they were from another planet. Then the senior officer turned to me, apologized for the intrusion, and said, "We can't do anything here because this is a civil matter. There's no probable cause to think you've committed any crime." He then informed Fiona and Candace that calling 911 for a non-emergency like this could potentially be considered a misuse of emergency services. Fiona's face went pale, but she tried to argue that it was an emergency for the association because I was obstructing the uniformity of the neighborhood. The senior officer shot that down, telling them that's not how emergencies work, and if they continue to use 911 for trivial disputes, they risk legal repercussions themselves. The younger officer added in a somewhat exasperated tone, "You can settle this in civil court if you think you have a case, but from what I see, you don't." And with that, the officers got back in their cars and left. Fiona and Candace lingered for a moment, clearly embarrassed, before stomping away in a huff, proclaiming, "We'll take further action, you'll see." At this point, I was a mix of relieved, amused, and downright furious. The nerve of calling the police because I wouldn't sign up for their petty organization was almost comical, but it also left a bitter taste in my mouth. I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I wasn't looking for a fight, but if they were going to continue harassing me, I needed to protect myself. I contacted Ingrid again, and also got in touch with a local attorney, Kevin, who specialized in property law. We arranged a meeting at my kitchen table, spreading out all the documents and letters I'd received. Kevin was incredulous when he read the lines threatening me with liens, daily fines, and even foreclosure if I didn't comply. "This is bluster and potentially illegal intimidation," he said. "We can send them a cease and desist. That might get them off your back." So we did exactly that. Kevin drafted a strongly worded letter citing the relevant property statutes, references to my deed's explicit exemption from any future neighborhood association, and a firm warning that if their harassment continued, we might pursue legal action for attempted fraud or harassment. I mailed it out, both via certified mail and standard post, to the HOA's main office. Then I waited, hoping that it would be enough to get them to back off. Meanwhile, I tried to go on living my life. One of my rescue dogs, a sweet old hound named Toby, needed extra care for a leg injury, so I spent a lot of my free time nursing him. I also dedicated hours each day to tending my orchard, pulling weeds, and checking the fruit for any signs of pests. I'd always believed in living peacefully, minding my own business, and letting others do the same. But Fiona and her associates seemed hell-bent on controlling everything around them. A couple of days after sending the cease and desist, I was out by the creek, clearing out some brush to make the water flow more freely, when my neighbor Marigold came by. She was one of the few folks in the actual HOA who still had a warm and kind demeanor. She admitted that the board was in a frenzy over me, claiming I was refusing to fulfill my neighborhood duties. Marigold apologized on behalf of what she called the overzealous folks in charge. She explained that many residents didn't share the board's desire to annex my land, but felt powerless to speak up because the board often used intimidation tactics on them too. Hearing that just solidified my resolve. In the following week, I tried to keep a low profile. Then I got an unexpected call, this time from a local journalist, Janine, who was researching HOA horror stories. Apparently, word had gotten out that these folks had called 911 to force membership. She wanted to interview me. I was hesitant at first because I didn't want more trouble, but Ingrid encouraged me to give Janine a statement. It might put public pressure on them to back off, Ingrid said. So I did a brief interview over the phone, explaining how I'd been harassed and threatened. I made sure not to mention names or the exact association in order to avoid defamation claims, but I gave enough context that it was clear what they were trying to pull. Janine ran the story on a small local news blog. I saw it a few days later, and while it didn't go viral or anything, it certainly circulated enough to stir the pot among locals. Comments ranged from outrage to disbelief. The piece led with, "Property owner harassed by overreaching HOA board, 911 called in attempt to force membership." People were shocked. A few recognized the association involved and started sharing their own experiences of intimidation. That's when I started to realize this was bigger than me. The board was apparently notorious for bullying tactics, but few had ever tried to hold them accountable. Shortly after the story hit the blog, I received another letter from the HOA's office. This one was a different tone altogether. Instead of threats, it read like a carefully composed attempt at damage control. It apologized for any misunderstandings and stated that the board intended to reach an amicable resolution that respects all parties. I nearly rolled my eyes out of my skull reading it. The letter requested a face-to-face meeting at their community center to discuss a possible agreement. My gut reaction was to refuse. However, Ingrid and Kevin thought it might be strategically wise to attend, so we could put everything on record and see if they'd publicly back down. So I agreed on the condition that I could bring my attorney. The day of the meeting, I walked into their large community hall and was greeted by a circle of board members seated behind a long table. Fiona was there, along with Candace and Bernard, plus a few others who looked vaguely familiar. They'd set out extra chairs on the other side, presumably for me and Kevin. Once we sat down, Fiona kicked things off, trying her best to sound diplomatic. She thanked me for coming, apologized again for the miscommunication, and said that they recognized my property wasn't originally part of the association. But then she tried to pivot, claiming that due to expansions in the official neighborhood boundaries, it was now customary for all landowners in the area to join. Kevin interjected, calmly stating that there was no legal basis for that claim, and that my deed explicitly excluded my property from any such arrangement. Bernard tried to argue that a county decision a few years back allowed the association to incorporate additional parcels, but Kevin presented documents showing that those expansions excluded properties that had explicit grandfathered status, like mine. The debate went on for nearly an hour. It felt like a polite courtroom drama, but I could sense the tension building. The more Kevin challenged their legal authority, the more a few of the board members fidgeted. Some, like Candace, looked furious. Others looked downright uncomfortable, possibly because they realized that the board's push was on shaky ground. Eventually, Fiona asked if we could come to a compromise, meaning I would at least pay some fees to show goodwill. That was so galling that I had to keep from laughing. I told them, "I don't see any reason for a compromise. My property is mine alone, and I don't use any of your amenities. I'm not going to pay you just to keep the peace." I glanced at Kevin, who nodded in agreement. He reiterated that any attempt to force me to sign or pay fees without a proper legal framework could be seen as extortion. The mention of the word extortion made Bernard's face go red. He shot back, "We're just trying to ensure the community thrives. It's not extortion to ask every resident to do their fair share." Kevin calmly repeated that I'm not part of their community, as outlined in the very deed that had been on record for decades. Fiona stood and abruptly ended the meeting, saying we were stuck. She said they'd explore further legal options. Kevin said we'd defend my rights and countersue for harassment. I left that room feeling like they were a cornered animal likely to try something else. Maybe something sneaky since the legal route wasn't working. Sneaky was their next move. Small oddities around my property started it. A violation notice was pinned to my fence one morning, claiming I violated the association's rules for having unapproved structures. It was probably referring to my old barn or dog kennels, but I didn't know. My mailbox was also occasionally left open, which never happened before. I occasionally saw unfamiliar cars slowing down near my driveway, as if inspecting. I felt like they were trying to scare me into giving in. Then a county official called about a code violation on my property. Someone complained I was dumping hazardous materials into the creek. The blood boiled. No, I did not. Only eco-friendly organic fertilizer from my orchard was near the creek. I invited the official to inspect if needed. A few days later, they did a quick walkthrough and took water samples and found no pollution. Officials closed the case. This was clearly the HOA board's malicious attempt to force county inspectors on me. A mysterious HOA lawyer sent me a letter around the same time. The letter repeated the forced membership nonsense to intimidate me. It included a bullet-point list of neighbor complaints about my rescue dog's noise, unkempt landscaping, and other minor issues. These were the board's usual petty tactics. I sent Kevin the letter, and he replied to warn them to stop. For 2 more weeks, complaints, small-scale harassment, and me proving my legality continued. Finally, a dramatic tipping point occurred. I was stunned when I saw several yard signs with the HOA's logo and the words, "Future Site of Official Community Gardens," authorized by the neighborhood council, staked along my property one morning. They invaded my land overnight and put up these signs as if it were decided. I dug one up and found it hammered in. Furious, I removed and piled up all the signs in my truck bed. Amidst that, my neighbor Marigold came over, eyes wide, and said, "I saw them late last night. 2 board members drove around hammering these in with flashlights. I assumed you approved." That was my final straw. I felt like they were stealing my property. I immediately called Ingrid and Kevin. We considered filing trespassing and vandalism complaints. Marigold offered a statement if needed. Kevin completed all paperwork. We filed a formal complaint at the sheriff's office later that day. I spoke with a deputy who was sympathetic to the fiasco rumors. He suggested I get footage of them putting up the signs. Luckily, my tiny security cameras captured 4 people, including Candace and Bernard, pounding signs into my land in grainy detail. With Marigold's statement and security footage, we were ready to act. The sheriff promised to question them. I left the station relieved and angry. Relief that I might finally hold them accountable, and anger that it had escalated. The sheriff's office confirmed speaking to the board members the following week. They claimed legality. The deputy bluntly told them they couldn't enter my property without permission until a court rules otherwise. They were warned harshly. However, the consequences continued. When county officials discovered the board posting signs on private land without permission, they intervened. Apparently, the HOA had no permit for a community garden or similar. The county sent the board a notice of violation for misrepresenting their authority over land they didn't own. This was significant because lying to the county about property usage is different from an internal dispute with a private citizen. Local media that had covered my case heard about this, adding to the storm. Janine again requested coverage of the unauthorized signs. I was reluctant to talk, but I realized that exposing these antics might be the best way to protect myself and prevent them from doing something even more outrageous. I agreed to another brief interview, still careful not to name the HOA. She posted the story online, citing county records to prove the board's violation. As people protested these harsh tactics, community sentiment changed quickly. The board sent me one last letter signed by Fiona a month after the sign incident. It was very different in tone. They expressed regret for the unfortunate events, promised to respect my property rights, and promised no further attempts to annex or charge me. Though they called it a mutual understanding, they gave up. I wanted to throw the letter away, but Kevin advised me to keep it for my records. He also advised me to write a brief letter stating that I accept their notice and expect them to comply forever. Since then, harassment has stopped. I no longer get random complaints, fake code violation calls, or yard signs. I can let my rescue dogs run around without worrying about a board member appearing from the bushes. The orchard is thriving, and I've turned a small section into a weekend community produce stand where anyone can buy fresh fruits at a discount. Some HOA residents buy from me because they want good local produce and don't care about politics. They apologize for the board's actions, but I don't hate my neighbors. Only the bullies who violated my rights. Internally, the association was criticized by its members, I later learned. Some refused to pay fees until the board's leadership changed. Others demanded spending transparency. A HOA faction sought to replace Fiona and Bernard with more reasonable people. The details are unknown, but Fiona reportedly resigned. Though still involved, Bernard's influence has declined. It appears that malicious attempts to annex other properties have been abandoned. No full lawsuit was filed. I saw potential, but after the board conceded defeat and promised to leave me alone, I moved on. Just being left alone on my beloved land was my biggest goal. I see them around town occasionally. Some run away in shame while others nod politely. Because I'm happy to live my life without their interference, I don't engage. It was exhausting, but I learned that bullies who use bluff and bluster can be defeated if you stand your ground and document everything. My grandfather's advice still applies. Don't let anyone push you around when the law and your rights are on your side. My barn protects the rescue animals I take in. My orchard is my sanctuary, and the old farmhouse is still painted in its timeless mellow yellow. Every morning, I thank myself for refusing to let an overbearing HOA dictate how I should live on my inherited land. I sometimes recall the police responding to the most ridiculous 911 call. It reminds me how far this went, and how easily it could have been avoided if the board had respected my property boundaries and the law. I might have found common ground with them if they had approached me as a neighbor rather than an adversary. Even if I didn't join their group, we could have coexisted without hostility. Arrogance and entitlement got the best of them. I defended myself with the help of 2 good friends and legal ownership. Punishments were as expected. A massive reputational hit, a stern warning from law enforcement, county scrutiny, and internal revolts from their own members. They wasted time and money on pointless legal maneuvering before giving up. I stay calm and out of their reach. Justice wasn't a harsh prison sentence or a grand jury indictment, but it was the perfect karmic payback for those who thought they could take someone's property. Sometimes the best punishment is a public, undeniable, and lasting humbling. I'm back to my priorities. My orchard is producing like never before. Toby has nearly recovered, and I've taken in 2 more stray dogs from a highway. I work honestly, pruning trees, harvesting produce, caring for animals, and chatting with neighbors who stop by for apples or sweet peppers. When people stay to themselves, life is lovely. For backup, I keep those letters in a folder in my desk drawer, but mostly, I'd rather forget it. I occasionally tell the story when someone asks about HOAs or property disputes, but I try not to dwell on it. Perhaps this ordeal has made me appreciate my grandfather's legacy more. He left me land that symbolizes our family's resilience, independence, and connection to nature. He always believed a home should be a place to live freely and shape one's own destiny. That's what I do. No HOA, even the most oppressive, can take that from me. Now that the county and local media are investigating, I doubt they'll try again. The nuisance calls and letters have stopped, and I've heard no official talk about expanding their boundaries. The battle seems won for me. I hope my story inspires others in similar situations to know their rights, stand their ground, and don't be intimidated by unfounded threats. When facts and law support you, you have more power than you think. My Spring Small Orchard Festival is my next big event. It's small, a few families, local artists, and fresh fruit and pies. I'm decorating the orchard with handmade signs. Welcome to the farmhouse orchard. Come enjoy nature. This time, those signs will go up with my consent on my property, where I make the decisions. If the old board wants to attend, they can, as long as they remember whose land it is and leave the HOA drama at their gated community. Fair and square, this land is mine. Despite sending fancy letters or calling 911, unscrupulous groups cannot change the truth. It stressed me out and wasted my time, but the result was worth it. They discovered that using the police to force someone into a private organization is immoral and illegal. If they use the emergency number for that, the local authorities won't forget. Overall, I'm stronger and closer to this place. I plan to live in my orchard on my own terms. Nobody will coerce me into anything I didn't agree to. The best part is knowing I'm not alone. Many people dislike being bullied by HOAs, corporations, or other overreaching entities. Sometimes all it takes is courage to stand tall, gather your evidence, and calmly remind them you're protected by law. I did that, and that was enough. In the early evenings, I sit on the porch with sweet tea or lemonade and watch the sun set behind the orchard. The barn towers above my dogs, who lounge by my feet. I occasionally see a HOA board car drive by, but they no longer stop. Learned their lesson. I hope this warns them and others who might try similar tactics. Never underestimate the little guy who knows his rights. Instead of being a bully, try being a good neighbor to build a thriving neighborhood. Friends, thank you. See you soon.